name is Joel Troge, and I'm the Director of Long-Term ELS, Newcomers, and SIFE, that's Students with Interrupted Inconsistent Formal Education, with the Division of Multilingual Learners. And I'd like to also introduce Mike with that in the chat as well. That Padlet, I'm going to follow up, not just today, but also after the session. So please do use that. So this session and the resource, like emphasizing, you're going to get a resource here that I will be sharing with you later, positions formative assessment and use evidence of student learning to improve student understanding of intended disciplinary learning outcomes and support students to become self-directed learners. Effective use of the formative assessment process requires students and teachers to integrate and embed the following practices in a collaborative and respectful classroom environment. And those practices are clarifying learning goals and success criteria within a broader progression of learning, eliciting and analyzing evidence of student thinking, engaging in self-assessment and peer feedback, providing actionable feedback, and using evidence and feedback to move learning forward by adjusting learning strategies, goals, or next instructional steps. So a lot of words there, right? And you may have noticed that the definition did not specifically mention multilingual learners or English language learners. But these students too are included in the all students mentioned in the first sentence. There is no unique definition of formative assessment for multilingual students. But there are specific considerations that educators should make as they plan to implement formative assessment with multilingual learners and ELS. And there are also specific reasons that multilingual learners and ELS especially benefit from those efforts, which is why we are stressing the efficacy of formative assessment for multilingual students. Learning goals and success criteria. As you can see in the graphic on the right of your screen, establishing clear goals, clear learning goals and expectations when developing success criteria with students is the foundation of learning through formative assessment. So let's model that now in our own learning goals for the session. Today, during the session, we will identify how formative assessment specifically benefits multilingual learners and English language learners. Second, we will establish formative assessment as an empowering practice to build strong learning relationships between teachers and multilingual learners. And finally, we will introduce a resource specifically created for school leaders and teachers to implement formative assessment practices for multilingual learners and ELS across content areas and grade levels. So in the formative assessment series that I facilitated this year, most of my participants were already quite familiar with learning goals, and I'm guessing that you might be as well. However, many participants were less familiar with developing success criteria in the classroom. So let's turn to that now. Take a minute to enter into the chat which statement, just a number is fine, is most closely aligned to how you would define your success by attending this session. And note that there is no right or wrong response. So statement number 1, I am able to include my multilingual students as learning partners. Statement number 2, I can transform my classroom by valuing effort and growth. And statement number 3, I will rethink how and why students give and receive feedback. And we make in the resource is that when developing success criteria with students, use sentence starters like I can, I will be able to, and we will. They're not only useful models of English for your students, but also sentence structures that set up students for growth and invites them to share their hopes, their dreams, and developing knowledge of self. This quote from Culture Responsive Teaching for Multilingual Learners shows the importance of taking the time to co-construct success criteria with students. So in order to incorporate self and peer assessment into your teaching, an important first step is to support multilingual learners in understanding their strengths and areas for growth more broadly, and to set individual learning goals. So it's not just about setting goals, it's also a way for us educators to learn about our multilingual students on a daily basis and act on that knowledge. And that's what makes us a culturally responsive form of assessment for our students. Evidence of student thinking. So let's take this opportunity to look more closely at our multilingual students in the New York City Department of Education. So English language learners in the state of New York are classified into 3 groups: newcomers, developing, and long-term Ls, based on their respective years of L service. While each group has different assets and needs to consider, I am going to focus in this session on newcomer Ls, which represent about 1/2 of all English language learners. Newcomer Ls are students who have received 3 or less years of L services and are relatively evenly distributed among the different grade levels. It might surprise you to learn that 44% of newcomers are born here in the United States. It is important to differentiate newcomer Ls who are new to the English language from newly arrived students who are new to the country, although both of those terms apply to the 56% of newcomer Ls who are born outside of the United States. One other thing to note is that newcomer Ls demonstrate varying proficiency levels in English. More than 1/3 of newcomer Ls were at the higher transitioning or expanding levels in 2021. So although you may hear newcomer and they immediately think, oh, new to English, that's not always the case. And that diversity of proficiency levels makes heterogeneous grouping strategies especially effective to accelerate learning for newcomers. And you'll see many recommendations to use student pairs or small groups in the formative assessment examples detailed in the resource. On the other side, one support that newcomer Ls generally need is structures to develop their academic language and skills. And we have already explored one way to do that by using clear learning objectives at student zone of proximal development, while also introducing new academic vocabulary into those familiar structures. And you'll see more suggestions for how to do this in the resource. But there's a bigger reason. There's a bigger reason that we are positioning formative. We know a little bit more about our students. Here are several recommended strategies and techniques to elicit evidence from newcomer Ls for analysis. Use learning portfolios to have students select which work they want to present and reflect on their growth over a period of time. Employ journal prompts for self-reflection in students' home languages and in English. Enlist student input to build classroom norms and routines for peer feedback and post them for students to reference. Build multiple, emphasis on multiple, opportunities in your lesson plans for students to engage in academic talk. That's one of the things we definitely know from research, is that multilingual students are often less exposed to academic talk. And give your newcomers multiple ways to indicate that they may need help, including nonverbal signals beyond just raising their hand. Newly arrived students may especially benefit from this, as there may be cultural norms to not interrupt an adult teacher. So even if they have the language ability to speak up, they may not raise their hand and interrupt an adult, perhaps because of a Padlet in the chat to help capture the questions. But I would love to talk more about that if we have time at the end. Engage in self-assessment and peer feedback. But let's focus on self-assessment first. Self-assessment can be as simple as a direct question like, how often do multilingual students in your classroom co-create success criteria, assess their own work, analyze other students' thinking, provide feedback to other students, use feedback to develop next steps? Hopefully, after this session, the answer to all of these questions will be more often. Sometimes, however, self-assessment can be more sophisticated in its implementation. So let's take a look at an example of that in this short video.
I can do this on my own, or level 4, I'm an expert. So I try to explain to the kids too that level 4 is not always a choice, because you have to be an expert or teach other children. So a lot of the times we're always reaching our goals, and we're always practicing reaching our goals. So even with adults, I try to tell them we're never really there. We're always learning something new. So
right, but it may not be the best fit for your grade or for your content area or for your students, right? So here are some ways to encourage self-assessment practices for other types of students. So younger students, very young students might benefit from using personalized popsicle sticks, which have the added benefit of making their choice consequential. right, when it is placed inside of a specific response box. Older students can use an app like Poll Everywhere or Mentimeter to respond using their personal devices. SIFE students might benefit from making their self-assessment in public. This shared aspect makes the task more observable for students to follow and more comfortable to learn in community. Students with higher English proficiency levels could use a video recording app like Flipgrid for them to self-assess and explain their rationale. And this could also be done in a home or target language as well. And bilingual students can be given the option to respond in whichever language form they choose, and then reflecting on that decision becomes a formative assessment of their own language development. So again, there's many different ways that formative assessment can take. It really, the teachers and educators on the ground are really the ones to make those decisions. Feedback. Of all the formative assessment practices that we have looked at so far, from my experience, this is the one that teachers, even thoughtful, highly effective teachers, tend to forget or give less attention to. And so let's give an example. So in this vignette, the teacher, Elicit, uses a gallery walk as a routine for formative assessment. The majority of students in Elicit's high school, almost 75%, are of Dominican heritage. She is currently teaching a unit on the theme of identity, and students are reading The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz as their anchor text. A third of the way into the novel, Elicit wants to assess and make sure that students are clearly understanding what they are reading. To do this, she places 7 quotes from that section around the classroom and asks students to go on a gallery walk, placing red sticky notes in the quotes that are unclear to them, green sticky notes on quotes that they understood, and yellow sticky notes on quotes that they have a question about. She encourages students to work together. So this is clearly an example of culturally responsive instruction, right? But is this an example of formative assessment? Let's put on our supervisor hats and give some feedback to Elicit. Because we want to frame this feedback as an opportunity for growth, we'll use a rose, thorn, bud routine. We'll give a rose for something that we liked, a thorn for a challenge or missed opportunity, and a bud for a way to enhance the activity and ultimately make the feedback actionable for Elicit. So a rose, I like how you provide students with an opportunity to visually assess their own understanding of the learning. The use of different challenge, I wonder if the prompt to have students work together may need more clarity or may actually distract from self-assessment. So while the prompt to collaborate by itself is not necessarily bad, it could be used more purposefully to make this a more complete example of formative assessment, which leads to our growth opportunity for Elicit, our bud. I think it might be beneficial for students to work together after the gallery walk, meeting with partners to address the quotes that they both found unclear or had questions about. So this is the actionable piece that teachers often forget to include. What should students be doing with all of this evidence and analysis? What are teachers doing with this new knowledge? If we don't act on what we know, then ultimately we are not being responsive. It is only by completing the whole process of formative assessment, evidence, analysis, and action, that makes formative assessment a truly responsive assessment. So to help your multilingual students give, receive, and act on feedback, use clear routines to focus the attention on the evidence and feedback. If the rose, thorn, bud routine isn't your style, find something that works for you and don't abandon it, right? The more that you use a routine with students, especially newly arrived students, the easier it will be for them to focus on the content of the message. When possible, pair students with similar home languages. Feedback can be shared in any language and should be shared in any language. Provide rubrics and checklists for students to reference in their feedback and tie those back to the learning goals for students to make those connections. Model reflective thinking out loud for the class when assessing student evidence. This internal thought process is incredibly important for students to hear and see self-reflection. And finally, as much as possible, use the same words and phrases from the learning expectations in the feedback that you give to students. This not only makes the feedback actionable, but this is also a sound language learning practice. So they're seeing it in multiple contexts. Okay, our last one, core practice number 5. Core practice number 5 prompts us to use evidence and feedback, which at this point might sound a bit redundant. But I like to think that that simple repetition speaks to the power that formative assessment can have on our practices. This is something that can re-energize your love for teaching and learning. And you may soon find that you too will become an advocate for formative assessment. So let's take a look at an example that speaks to that transformative power in this video from JHS 223 in Brooklyn.
Guide students to generate kind, thoughtful, and effective feedback. The ladder of feedback asks students to formulate their assessments in the following way. First, questions of clarification, such as, am I reading this correctly? Second, comments on value. For example, what I think works really well is. Third, comments of concern, such as, what I worry about is. And fourth, suggestions for revision, i.e., maybe this part would work better if you. Students may also base their feedback on the rubric you have created with them for the assignment. It is critical that as students confer, you walk around your classroom to monitor progress and ensure that the ladder of feedback is properly applied, that each student is receiving useful feedback, and as importantly, when your class completes the peer assessment process, students will have ample time to revise their work.
Vocabulary that I would try to teach before.
To implement a formative assessment, you have probably heard me say growth more than once during the session, and that means that we have to talk about how this work might require a shift in your colleagues' mindsets, and that is real, right? That is really real, and especially difficult when so many demands are already placed on teachers, who are asked to attend to both the content area and the social emotional learning needs of all of their students, including multilingual learners. So why focus on formative assessment, especially when it requires buy-in from already busy teachers? Because the research tells us that this learning is integrated. Neuroscience advances show that parts of the brain are cross-wired and functionally interconnected. As a result, learning is integrated. There is not a math part of the brain that is separate from the self-regulation or social skills part of the brain. For students to become engaged, effective learners, educators need to develop students' content-specific knowledge alongside their cognitive, emotional, and social skills. So we know that formative assessment is empowering for students, transformative for teachers, and culturally responsive and inclusive for our multilingual learners. So what's stopping us from implementing this? A lack of examples, models, suggestions for applications, supporting research. All right, so that is all here in the resource that I will share with you now. If you can maybe just pause in the chat 1 second. So I'm gonna put the link to it right now. So just kind of please don't just, if you could let people get that link for a second, and that resource as well on goals. So kind of similar to what we looked at earlier in learning expectation for learning goal number 1. A content area AP might want to focus their department's inquiry cycle on discussing quality of work, or quality and improvement using samples of work, something I mentioned in core practice number 3. Or a school leader might want to norm their entire school's practices by having all teachers provide clear learning expectations with success criteria. And what you'll notice is that in the table for each example, you'll see the reasoning behind why we are recommending that type of formative assessment, the specific benefits for your multilingual students, as well as suggestions for application and any adaptations that you may want to make to the example. So this resource not only gives you the flexibility to enter the work, but it also provides concrete examples and directions to embed these practices into your schools and classrooms. .com/FA4MLS. Okay, so again, you can type that in and then get that resource if you're viewing this on a recording. Back to a quote from Zaretta Hammond's work, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, that initially inspired me to really lean into this work. The ultimate goal is to help students take over the reins of their learning. This is the social justice aspect of culturally responsive teaching. The first step toward independent learning is acquiring the tools to be more data-driven in one's decision-making about learning tactics and strategies. Dependent learners have been conditioned to be passive when it comes to making decisions about their learning moves. They have relied on the teacher to tell them what to do next. If they are to become more independent, we have to provide them with the tools. So in that spirit, I hope that this session, and especially the resources provided, give you the tools to embed formative assessment for your multilingual students and partner with them to co-create success in the classroom. So it's a little bit slight, maybe different thinking about it, but ultimately it's responding to the people that we work for, our students. I think also to that point, I really like this quote from Making Thinking Visible. When thinking becomes part of the daily practice of the classroom and teachers show an interest in and respect for students' thinking, then students who had not previously been seen as academically strong begin to shine. When school is no longer about the quick right answer, but focuses on the expression of one's ideas, questions, and observations, then a new playing field is created for all students. So again, refocusing on thinking and growth. It's not about having the right or the wrong answer. It's about the process of getting there and what students doing, right? You can say, oh, they're writing a notebook, they're writing an essay. They also could be doing a scaffolded writing activity to help them. They could be writing in a home language. They could be doing a formative assessment, a self-reflection in a home language. So really, it's kind of the one way to think about it is there, and this is in the resource, that formative assessment is more of an idea than it is a thing. It's more of an idea than a thing, right? It's about getting the student to set a goal and make an action plan to get there based on evidence. And they can do that in any language. And I would argue that probably for many of our, especially newcomers, the home language is the one that's going to allow them to do that much quicker. You want to back up here is that, this is, formative assessment is different than like a screener, right? Where your school may need to purchase a screener, you may need to get a special thing, and they don't have them in every language of your student, right? It's not a Regents exam, where they may not have every language for your student. SIFE, students with interrupted, inconsistent formal education. So please, if you want to sign up for that SIFE share, that would be a great way to connect in the future. There's also our SharePoint site, all the great things. And of course, just email dml@schools.nyc.gov. And we'll make sure we get all of these resources. Thank you. I do want to also shout out the NYC Schools Tech for the future.